Good evening. Welcome to Indie Tiger's Sci-Fi Review. I'm Indie Tiger. In this video, we're going to take a deep dive into Lieutenant Sulu and Ensign Chekhov by me, a former U.S. Navy Quartermaster and Master Helmsman. This video was requested by Robert Stevens. Robert, I hope you're watching, and I'm really excited to do this video for you because Star Trek is the reason I joined the U.S. Navy, because I wanted to learn how to navigate ships by the stars. So, what is a quartermaster in the U.S. Navy? Unlike the other branches of the service that have quartermasters, a quartermaster in the U.S. Navy is a navigation specialist. The other branches of service, a quartermaster would be somebody who's in charge of supplies or quarters, and that is not the case in the U.S. Navy. The U.S. Navy quartermaster started back in the days of the wooden sailing vessels, where the raised platform, the quarter deck at the back of the ship, had to have a petty officer to keep the order on the quarter deck. That person was the quartermaster. And as it evolved over time, the quartermaster became less necessary to keep order on the bridge. And so it evolved into this, what is today, someone who specializes in navigation. As such, the quartermaster also becomes a master helmsman. That's part of the qualifications to become a quartermaster, at least in my experience. Most of the helms duties are handled by the deck division, the bosun's mates, and those guys stand watch at the helm in 1 hour intervals. And this is my experience in the U.S. Navy. So if you were a quartermaster in the Navy as well, your mileage may vary. This is just one person's experience. So a quartermaster, as I say, navigates the ship. He uses various instruments. You see me in the middle with a sextant in hand taking a sunshot to get local apparent noon. On the right-hand side, I'm standing there at the chart table with a pair of dividers in my hand, which are used to measure distances in latitude and longitude to fix the ship's position on the chart. And again, as a quartermaster, I had to become a qualified master helmsman as well. So there I am on the left, steering the ship. And I think we were close to shore in this instance, and so it required a master helmsman, not just somebody who was qualified as helmsman, but it required somebody who had more training for dangerous evolutions. So dangerous evolutions include things like underway replenishment and getting underway from any harbor or port, including home port, because you're in tight spaces. And we had to pass under the Narragansett Bay Bridge every time we were coming into home port or getting underway. So you were close to the bridge columns. And so it was, as I say, it's tight quarters to try to navigate a ship in. And underway replenishment is two ships that are side by side steering the same course and speed with a line across. It's either a cable or a fuel line, and you're getting fuel from the other ship or you're getting supplies passed along this cable, and you're so close that there's a vortex that forms between the two ships that tends to pull those ships together, which causes them to want to collide. Or if you're too far apart, you get too much tension in the fuel line or the cable, and it will snap potentially and cause serious injury, if not, and possibly death. So you're only a couple of hundred, you're maybe 150 feet apart from each other while you're doing this. So the master helmsman has to be much better at keeping the ship on course than just your average helmsman who is standing watch during during evolutions that are not as dangerous, like when you're in the open ocean and there's very little navigation hazard. So Mr. Sulu then must be a master helmsman. So as I say, a master helmsman is somebody who is more qualified at standing watch on the helm, and this is not a full-time job in the Navy. Being a helmsman is not something that you do for several hours at a time. You do it for maybe an hour at a time. So this is a departure from what the U.S. Navy does, because Mr. Sulu is on watch for several hours as helmsman. And in the U.S. Navy, you have a group of deck division people, the bosun's mates, and those guys who rotate through several positions on the bridge and as lookouts. So you start off as messenger of the watch potentially, and then an hour later you're standing on the helm steering the ship, and then an hour after that you are the bridge talker, and the bridge talker goes to become the forward lookout, and the forward lookout goes to aft lookout, and aft lookout becomes messenger of the watch, and as I say, messenger of the watch goes to become helmsman. So through 4 hours or 5 hours of watch standing, you're only at each position for 1 hour at a time. Now, some of these dangerous evolutions can last longer. So, like getting underway could be as long as 2 hours, as I recall. And so you would be standing watch for a longer period of time as a master helmsman potentially. Now, I was a sailor for only a few years, right? I only served 4 years and then I got out of the Navy. There are people who have served 20 years who I know watch this channel. Alan, if you're watching, shout out to you, guy. And if you see him, his screen name is Sailor by Choice. Go ahead and say hello to him and say thank you for his service, because he served for 20 years. So as a master helmsman, Mr. Sulu would be in charge of things like being on the helm during close quarters, like when they're in orbit around another planet with another ship or several ships. In this instance, we see the Exeter and the Enterprise together. And in one of the episodes, it's court-martial. There are several ships in orbit, so you would have a master helmsman at the helm during that time as well, I would believe, because you're in such tight quarters with all the other ships. Another reason you would have a master helmsman at the Enterprise helm would be when you're alongside a space station like K7, and the Klingons show up as well. So you would want to have, again, you're in very tight quarters, so you would want to have a master helmsman on duty. And especially when you're exiting space dock, you would want to have a master helmsman, not just a helmsman. So that would be what Mr. Sulu would be doing as helmsman. This is a departure from the U.S. Navy, as I say, because your helmsman is only there for an hour or if you're doing underway replenishment or getting underway or coming into port, maybe a couple of hours of a master helmsman's day would be steering the ship. So if Mr. Sulu is the helmsman for more than that amount of time, then something else may be going on with him. He may be learning ship handling as well. So his job as an officer, as a junior officer, is to learn all of the functions of the ship. So he might start off as a division officer for the chief engineer, Mr. Scott, as either the main propulsion assistant or the damage control assistant, and then he'll become, for 6 months or a year, he'll be that, and then he'll go and do the next division. So he's learning as a line officer, he's learning all of the functions of every station that an officer would portray. So we know he was head of the physics department. So this may be his rotation for learning ship handling. Or he may be standing watch as the helmsman, but he could also be the weapons officer. So he may be the department head of weapons. Now, this is pure speculation on my part, or he may be learning ship handling as part of the weapons department. That may be what department the helmsman is in, because we know that Mr. Sulu has an interest in ancient weapons. He's a master swordsman, we know that, and he's also interested in projectile handguns, we know that. So he may be the weapons officer in charge when Kirk and Spock are away. He's often portrayed as being the person who's learning how to fight the ship. And so in this instance, he's fighting the Gorn in the episode Arena. So he has fought the Gorn in Errand of Mercy. He's left in charge when Kirk and Spock go down to the planet to negotiate with the Organians. And he's told, if the Klingons show up in force, get back to the fleet. Don't try to fight them off. If it's closer in odds, then yeah, you're fine to fight the ship. But if they show up with several ships, don't worry about us. Take off. Go get the fleet and come back. In a third season episode called Day of the Dove, he's also in charge of retaking the engineering department. Kirk remembers that he's the master swordsman, so he is ordered to retake the engineering department from the Klingons. And so my speculation is that Mr. Sulu is department head of at least one department, if not division officer. So because he's been a department head, I'm assuming that he's department head for some other department that's not named, probably weapons boss, or he's becoming the weapons boss, or he's becoming the department head for nav admin. So typically the department head for nav admin, in my experience, is the executive officer, and nav admin is navigation and administration. So navigation, you have a division officer who is in charge. On board ship that I was on board, it was the navigator, and the executive officer was the department head for nav admin. So the executive officer, first officer, these are interchangeable terms. In the U.S. Navy, it's executive officer. In other real world navies, it's first officer. But in this case, the executive officer is Mr. Spock. So that's about as much as I can say about Mr. Sulu being a helmsman and a master helmsman, because it's just not a job in the U.S. Navy the way that it is in Star Trek. It's a posting for an hour or two. So moving on, let's talk about Mr. Chekhov. So Mr. Chekhov is definitely a navigator. He's an officer, and he's a junior officer. And so he may or may not be the division officer for navigation. We don't know. It's never stated whether he is or he isn't. But as the navigator, his job would be to plot the course for the ship before it leaves space dock and inform the necessary departments what that course is going to be and what speeds are going to be used to achieve the destination at the pre-prepared time that they're expected to get there. So in this case, he would at least probably be talking to the main propulsion assistant, which again is somebody under Mr. Scott, the main propulsion assistant being in charge of fuel, and he would have to know how much fuel is needed to get from point A to point B, and Mr. Chekhov would inform him of the amount of time that it's going to take to get from point A to point B and what the distance is, so that the main propulsion assistant can turn around and compute how much fuel is necessary. As a navigator, he would also be in charge of keeping track of course changes that are not predetermined course changes. As we see in the Ultimate Computer, he's the one who's keeping track of where the M5 is taking them and how fast they are going. So by the time the M5 is finished taken over and has these unexpected course changes occur, he's plotting the position of the ship so that he can get us back to our original course and get us back to where we need to be in the time that we're supposed to be there. So we see him saying what course and speed they are going as they are fighting the mock fleet for the trials of the M5 computer. So navigating the ship requires various instruments, as I have said. In this case, we're gonna look at the thing in the middle of the nav and helm station. I've never heard what it's called canonically, and I can't find any reference to what it's called in non-canonical sources, but to me it looks similar to what we called a maneuvering board. And the maneuvering board is used not only to track your position, but to track positions of other ships. So you can tell using a maneuvering board, once you know a ship's position, course, and speed, and you know your course and speed and your position, you can predict future events with that maneuvering board, whether that ship is going to cross ahead of you, whether it's going to cross behind you, whether it's going to cross on your starboard side or your port side. So that is what a maneuvering board is used for. It's a piece of paper, and you use pencil and compass to determine on paper where this interaction is going to occur, what time it's going to occur, how far away you're going to be from each other. And in this case, this looks like partially that's what that is for, because there are two lines that are crossing each other. One of them is red, which I assume is the other course of the other ship, or in this case, the Doomsday Machine. And there's another line in the middle that shows potentially your course and speed and where the two intersect each other. They are trying to overtake the Doomsday Machine in some cases and come alongside it to fire at it at the, they'll change course at the last minute. They won't actually intersect it. So they want to fire on it. And you see Commodore Decker lean forward every once in a while, and you'll see Captain Kirk lean forward every once in a while before he gives a course and speed correction. So that's partly what I think this device is supposed to be for. The other thing I think it's for is your bearings. See what course you're taking, both horizontally. Sorry, got my directions backwards. Horizontally and vertically, as Wesley Crusher explains to lore in data lore. They will give a bearing horizontally, say mark, and then give another bearing vertically in a 360-degree arcs. So this has two rings, the outer ring and the inner ring, and they look like they're graduated in degrees. So that is what I believe this device is in the middle of the console. And every once in a while you'll see somebody reach down. It's either Mr. Sulu or Mr. Chekhov or somebody else reach down and make an adjustment to this device. So I believe that's what that is for. That is one of the instruments that is used for navigation. Another way you can fix the ship's position, because you fix the ship's position when you're underway every half an hour or so, if you're out to sea. If you're in port, it's every 2 minutes. And there's a couple of ways that you can do that. You can use bearings on objects that you know where they're located. And we used 3 bearings of known objects that are already plotted on the chart, like towers, or in the case of Narragansett Bay, we always used one of the columns of the bridge, because we had to pass under the bridge all the time, coming into port or going out of port. And there was a rocky outcropping with a building on top of it that had a cupola, so we used that because we had those things charted and we knew where they were located. And so you would take 3 bearings. Usually you want them to be 120 degrees apart, and where those 3 lines intersect on your chart, it makes a nice little triangle, and in the middle is where you are. In the middle of that triangle, that's where you are. So in this case, Mr. Chekhov could use sensors like radar as well for a distance and a visual bearing for a range to also fix the ship's position. If you know the distance from something that is charted and you know the bearing, a visual bearing on it, then you can say, okay, this is where the ship is, where the distance and the bearing intersect each other. So Mr. Chekhov would also be in charge of keeping charts up to date. So we get notice to mariners that say, oh, this buoy is out of position, or there's wreckage here. And so it would be part of his job or part of his team's job to keep track of all those things that are out of position, that have occurred, that are hazards to navigation, and updating the charts as this information comes in. He would also be in charge, or the navigation team is in charge of maintaining navigation equipment. This, again, is a little bit of a departure. In Gamesters of Triskelion, they're actually beaming down to perform routine maintenance on devices that are used for communication and navigation. And that is not something that the Navy does. We maintain our own excuse me. We maintain our own navigation equipment on board our ship, but it's usually the Coast Guard that maintains other navigational devices like lighthouses and buoys and things like that. So this is another departure from what the U.S. Navy does. Now, as I say, Chekhov is probably a junior. He is a junior officer. He may be a division head, or he may just be one of several navigators who reports to Mr. Spock, because Mr. Spock is the executive officer. And so in this case, Captain Kirk asked Chekhov and Mr. Spock to create a diversion while Kirk sneaks up on a native. And so they are pretending to argue with each other. And this seems in keeping with what the U.S. Navy would have the relationship be, the navigating department reporting to the executive officer. And we also see him working with Mr. Spock to try to locate a planet that they believe exists. They don't know that it exists, but we see him in auxiliary control helping Mr. Spock try to locate a planet based on orbital parameters and distance from the sun and so on and so forth for this group of people who are trying to find an idyllic world. So those are my thoughts on Mr. Chekhov and Mr. Sulu. And now, time to complain a little bit. So it's time for a Tiger Pounce. So Tiger Pounce is where I get to complain. My biggest complaint, and I think Darren Wagner has the same complaint, Star Trek is full of officers and you don't get to see a whole lot of enlisted people. And it's unrealistic to think that you're going to have all these officers doing these tasks that the enlisted people are trained to do specifically. I get it. Officers are more interesting, they're more colorful. So for dramatic purposes, it makes more sense to have more officers and less enlisted. But in reality, you're going to have a lot more enlisted than you are going to have officers. And the officers are going to be the department heads, the division officers, or junior officers reporting to their own to division officers. And they're not going to be the ones standing the watch necessarily. If they are standing a watch, they're standing watch as chief engineer, like Mr. Scott does when he's in engineering, or even when he's on the bridge. They're going to be standing the officer of the deck watch, which we see all of them do except for Lieutenant Uhura. We see Mr. Spock as officer of the deck. We see Lieutenant Sulu as officer of the deck. Or they're going to be the junior officer of the deck, which we see Mr. Chekhov take on, also known as the conning officer. So he takes on as junior officer of the deck at times. So we see that. Those are the watches they're standing, but they're being backed up by the enlisted personnel on the bridge, the bosun's mates, and the quartermaster. So that's my biggest complaint about Star Trek, is that it's less than realistic that way. But other than that, that is my thoughts on the two positions of helmsman and navigator. And so, final thoughts. I don't really have too much. I think that one thing that I want to start doing is recommending, if you have the money, if you can afford to, go to the World Wildlife Fund and support conservation efforts for tigers or other endangered species. I'm kind of preferential to tigers because my screen name is Indie Tiger. The reason it's Tiger and not, say, something else is because I was born in the year of the tiger, according to the Chinese zodiac. So I think that's pretty cool, being born in the year of the tiger. So Indie Tiger, Indie, ND are my initials. Tiger is the year I was born in. So Indie Tiger, if you were ever wondering, which you probably weren't, but there you go. There's the explanation for you anyway. And that's going to be it. Still images are courtesy of trekcore.com, and my Indie Tiger logo is created by DDX Design. And I hope everybody has a wonderful day. If you like this content, please hit the like button, comment, subscribe, watch my other videos. Any kind of engagement is helpful. I do this not for a living, but I still like to talk to everybody after the video comes out. And, hitting that like button and sharing it really gets the Google out there to promote my videos. So thank you very much. Have a great evening.